So as we've gone over time in other sessions, we have a rather shorter question and answer period. Hopefully we'll have the full hour tomorrow, but feel free during this period, anything that I've raised to this point that you wanted me to elaborate a bit more upon, any aspect of the text that you thought he probably should have said something about that, but he didn't, or anything arising from the discussion we've had to this point that you'd maybe want to think more about how do you apply that, or what are some of the ways you communicate that in my church setting. Feel free to ask me any questions along those lines or anything that just comes to mind. We have about half an hour, but I'll be sticking around afterwards. So, if you don't ask me a question in this more public time, I'm available to be asked in private. It's not even in books. It will be, at some point, in a book called Heirs Together, A Theology of the Sexes. But that's, people talk about the expectations that can be let down, and, well, it's been over 10 years in working, so it's going to happen at some point, I assure you. But unfortunately not. On certain of the issues, I've written on them specifically. So if you want one aspect of the talk elaborated upon, I might be able to point you to an article that I've written. But there's nothing that kind of brings it all together.
One question about the image of God. I thought you made an interesting point. Just the liberal mindset is to immediately gravitate toward image of God means I'm an individual image of God with dignity, value, and worth, which makes this idea of the sort of gendered union as the image of God much tougher to, I think it's totally biblical. How do you communicate that in layman's terms in a way, just because it's such a precious thing, the way people think about it, right? There's a lot of emotional attachment, and obviously it's true that we're individually images of God, but yet that image of God language in the Bible seems much more expansive and much more gendered in the way that it's, and so I don't know if there's any quick cheat notes for talking about that in a way that's helpful with people. But.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the first thing, you affirm the fact that this is true of each and every person. Maybe individual, not the right word, but there's a sense that every person should have of their God-given dignity. But then there's also a dignity that we enjoy in fellowship with others. And that dignity is something that can also be assaulted by the evil one, for instance. Satan will attack the dignity of the individual person, but also of the person in relationships. Something like adultery is an assault upon the image of God. And so people have a sense of, I think, on some level, that their dignity is not just about themselves by themselves, but it's themselves as involved with other people. The sort of dignity of the family and being loved by another, the dignity of marriage, the dignity of a community of people who recognize each other and act in a way that accentuates that dignity. The church, as the body of Christ, is a great example of the image of God. Of course, the image of God in its fullest sense. What is the image of God in its fullest sense? It's Christ. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And so, in some ways, implicit within that concept of the image of God is the fuller reality of being restored in Christ. That is how that image is fully seen. Now, I think we could maybe capture people's sense of image in just tapping into their very basic sense of place, recognition, hospitality, acknowledgement, these sorts of things. And when Paul talks about the image of God being restored, he talks about it as a social thing. The image of God, the new man, in which there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, etc. There's this sense that in that solidarity, where people are not at odds with each other. They're not destroying each other. There's a sense that that is the dignity. And so when you see a society that's at peace, and people have a sense, that's what I need. I need a society where that image is seen. So that's probably where I go. And I think within our society, we do have a very keen sense of assaults upon that image. That my place, for instance, it's not a subjective thing, nor is it a purely objective thing. Often it's an intersubjective thing. It's a sense of, how does that other person see me? Do I have a place that's recognized and acknowledged? Do I have dignity, not just in an abstract sense, but in the eyes of the other? And Christ has come to restore that was originally intended to be the way that we were.
Thanks for being here, first of all. But as I think about Genesis chapter 3 and the implications of the curse on men and women specifically, I'm curious if you could just talk through briefly what you see in those, what is given to man, what is given to women in that sense, and then are there any implications on that as we kind of work our way through the text and even to today?
Yes. First of all, the curses or the judgments don't stand by themselves. There's a sense in which they're all interwoven. So first of all, they can be mapped onto each other in various ways. There is an analogy between the fruit that's produced by the woman in pain and the fruit that is brought forth by the man in toil. And as you go through those two, they can be mapped onto each other in ways that suggest there's a sort of symmetry being explored here, and also a sort of intertwining. So where does the serpent get its seed from? The serpent's seed is the woman's struggle to bring forth children, faithful children, and the fact that that's going to be frustrated by the serpent in some ways, and she's going to find some of her children taken from her by the serpent. The serpent's seed are the thorns and the thistles that the man is going to bring forth from his labor. And so those judgments do not stand by themselves. They're intertwined. That's the first thing. I think a second thing is that each is related to the realm of their origin. And so the man is going to return to the dust from which he was formed. There's a sense in which the woman is going to turn back to the man and be frustrated by him. He's not going to be responsive to her as it seems he should be. Now, we can often see different approaches to this. People can see it as your desire will be, your desire will be for him. People can argue that that is saying that the woman wishes to usurp the man's place. I don't think that's what it's saying. We do actually have a statement in Song of Songs that talks about my desires for him and his for me. There's a sense of the reciprocity that in that relationship in Song of Songs, which is this idealized relationship in many respects, there is not a situation of the woman desiring the man and the man ruling over her. It's actually both desiring each other and both responsive to each other. And so what I think we have in Genesis is that sense that the woman wants the man. She wants him to be for her, to stand in her corner. She wants the man to exert his strength on her behalf. She wants the man to be responsive to her, and the man instead is actually going to domineer, which is not the ideal situation. And so that sets the two, they're implied in each other. The woman's judgment is one in which she will be frustrated in her relationship with the man. The man will be frustrated in his relationship with Mother Earth, the ground from which he was formed. It will not bring forth fruit for him in the same way, and he will return to it. He will return to the dust. What does the serpent eat? The serpent eats the dust. And so there's a sense in which the man becomes serpent food. The grave is the realm of the serpent's power. He rules through death. And so there is this involvement of the curses with each other. There's also a sense there that there are different foci for the labor of the man and the woman. So the woman, first of all, the judgments are gendered. It's not as if it's just a general judgment upon humanity that's the same. I mean, we're all implicated in these. It's not as if the woman does not return to the dust from which she was taken. It's not as if the woman does not experience toil. It's not as if the man doesn't bring forth fruit and pain in certain ways. All of these things are true of both, but to differing extents. And there is a sense in which the foci of the man and woman's work are differently placed. The woman is particularly in a situation where she's seeking to bring forth life and finding that that is something that's always attended by death and always attended by that struggle. And the man is seeking to bring forth life in the fundamental task that he was given. He was created to till the ground, to serve the ground. And the ground is now going to push back against him. So it's not as if women don't work the ground too, but there is a sense in which that task will primarily fall upon the shoulders of the man, not exclusively. And beyond that, I think we can... People very often, I think, read Genesis 3 as just the light goes off on the human race. But there's a sort of dimmer switch almost where you first hear the click in Genesis chapter 3, and then it just sin spreads from there. So you start off with the breaking of the relationship between father and children, between God and the man and the woman. And you see the breaking of the relationship between the man and the woman. The man's instinctive response is to blame his wife, but also to blame God, the woman that you gave me. And then as we go further, we can see that that gets played out in the relationship between brothers. Cain seeks to kills his brother Abel, and he fails to guard the garden. The beast that crouches at the door is like the serpent in chapter 3, and his desire is for him. Now, it's the same expression that's used in chapter 3, verse 16. What does it mean that the sin's desire is for Cain? Sin wants Cain to act on its behalf. Sin wants Cain's heart. Sin wants Cain's loyalty. And if it gets it, he'll become a seed of the serpent. And so the same sort of pattern is playing out within his story. And as it goes out, you can see there's a next exile, not just exile from the garden, but exile from the land. And go further still, and you can see the sons of God seeing the daughters of men that they are beautiful and taking them, and it's no longer just man and woman and their relationship to God, or brothers fighting against each other. It's now comprehensive. It fills the whole world. It's not just in the land or in the garden. It's the whole world. It's all the relationships. Now, if you read the sons of God as angelic spirits, then you've got the whole cosmos in a sort of rebellion. And you also have a situation where there is the thoughts and intents of man's heart, only evil continually. This is comprehensive corruption. It is found in every single area of man's thought and thinking, every area of his motivations and actions. And we can think about this maybe in terms of the way that people can be taken over by some perverse ideology. Think of some of the effects of communism, for instance, in certain societies, and the way it just perverts all these sorts of areas of life, or the way in which certain sins, when they take root in someone's life and grow to their full maturity, every single part of their life gets corrupted by it, or the effects of long-term drug addiction upon someone, and how it gradually hollows them out. This is the sort of thing that's described. So the curse, I think, is an initial judgment. It's there in part to establish firewalls to prevent things from going to their full extent. And we also, again, it's one of those things that get repeated. So there, Noah, after the flood, plants a garden, a vineyard, and then he takes of the fruit, and he is naked in his tent, and his son Ham comes in and calls his brothers in to shame his father, and it acts in a sort of to usurp him. and then there's a judgment upon the three of them, blessing upon two, and then curse upon Ham and his son Canaan. So there is a sort of playing out of a similar pattern elsewhere. So the curse story is, I think, important in that respect. There's a lot more going on when we pay attention to the literary character of the judgments.
Thinking about this earlier, you were talking about counterpart, being man and woman, you drawing something out of me, your wife drawing something out of you, more together, and I was thinking about that in the context of church leadership. We haven't
Yep.
gotten to that yet, but we'll go there tomorrow. But just wondered if you would comment on, obviously, a lot of times leadership in churches, because of people's conviction with the scriptures, tends to just be men, right? And so what you're talking about today, of kind of that drawing out of each other, what might the implications be for leadership in the church?
Yes, very good question. And I think, I don't want to tread too much on my toes of future Alistair. I'm going to get into this tomorrow. But when we think about these questions, it's often good to step back and to think about some of the things that we're bringing to those questions. So, for instance, the key category of leadership. Leadership tends to flatten out a lot of different things. A mother is a leader, a father is a leader, but it's not generic leadership. There's something distinctive about the way that a mother leads her family and the father leads that family. And their leadership is not competitive. Their leadership is actually mutually strengthening. The mother can be more effective as the father is more effective, and vice versa. But that almost requires a movement away from the sort of universal categories that tend to be invited by a sort of flattening out liberalism. And also what some have, Illich, for instance, talks about a logic of scarcity, where when you've flattened out all these things, people increasingly become rivals for these things that have been flattened out. So when only a few people can be the leaders, increasingly you set people up against each other. But if you have thought about it where leaders don't actually need to be rivals to each other, it's not a zero-sum game. There are different modes of leadership and different ways that leaders can strengthen each other and maybe just avoid that category of leadership altogether. I think there are more possibilities that open up. So first of all, things like leadership. Also, the concept of church leadership. There are a lot of things that are bound up in that concept of church, not least things of the structure of a community. For instance, if a community is, even that term community, when we think about a church, often we focus upon the leaders, those who are ordained, the institutional body and its representatives. So the person who's at the front on a Sunday morning. And yet, a lot of the church, in most settings, would not just be the person at the front on the Sunday morning. It's a wider life that has a significant existence and presence throughout the week that is not actually focused upon the guy at the front. There's a lot of life, as it were, leading from the middle, prominent figures in the middle. And if you look at the early church, many people go back to the text of Acts and they say, see all these prominent women, obviously Paul is arguing, or the book of Acts is arguing for women and men as leaders in the same way. Actually, that's not what we see. What we see rather is men and women both being prominent in the life of the church, but in different ways. They're both acting in ways that kind of play to their strengths, and both parties being stronger as they're playing to their strengths. And I think that is an important part. Also, as we flattened out the concept of leadership, the concept of the pastor becomes this fairly amorphous thing, and it tends to squeeze out other roles and also become the one role to rule them all. And one of the things that I think you see there is there's something about the role of the pastor, particularly in the age of professionalism, that loses its personal presence quality. And so, for instance, a father is more fundamental than fathering. or parent, certainly more than parenting. And it's almost as if we've moved from the category of father to the category of fathering, an active thing, to the category of parenting. And there's a level of abstraction to each step, and we've lost something. But there's something about the character of the pastor that's very specific. It's not just generic leadership, it's not just generic teaching. It's a very specific presence within the community. And it's a sort of presence that I think at its best is a sort of fatherly presence that is firm and good and clear and sets the fundamental emotional and spiritual and moral tone just by its presence. And ideally, I mean, one of the things you have with the good father figure, don't need to fight because the father's very presence has gravity to it. And so the father isn't going to have to fight to get his way. Rather, the presence is the thing that really matters. Everyone is calmer because everyone knows there's a sort of center of gravity here. The boundaries, you know where the boundaries are, and everyone feels safer. And in that situation, it's not a competitive thing. It's not leading over people, or a sort of Venkatesh Rao talks about leadering, the way that people with a certain role as the leader want to performatively exercise that role to show that they're top dog and to justify the title that they hold. And I don't think that's healthy either. And so I think maybe stepping back from the question, unpacking the categories a bit. I talk on occasions about tabooing terms. There are certain terms that do a lot of heavy lifting for us, and particularly in these sorts of debates. So things like complementarian or egalitarian. Taboo those terms. And if you've ever played the game Taboo, you're not allowed to mention those terms and certain other associated terms. Say what you want to say without using those terms. And you might find that what you're saying sounds very different. And there's a way, or think about terms like complementarian or egalitarian as suitcases. Now, as you're passing by, it helps you to recognize each other that you are carrying the same suitcase or the suitcase with the same name. But every now and again, take that suitcase and open it and look at all the contents, lay them out, and show what those contents are before you pack it in again. And that, I think, helps because many people are using these terms with very different senses. Another thing I find is pay attention to the difference between what you might think of as an architectural structure and a home. So the same architectural structure can be a horrific place to live in or a really glorious home. It depends how you inhabit it. And there are many ideas that we're talking about in these sorts of contexts that people have taken and made into horrific places. You don't want to live within that sort of system. It's just inhospitable and cruel. And that's one of the reasons why I think it can be helpful to maybe move away from some of these categories doing the heavy lifting and think about, okay, you've got these categories in place. What does it actually look like to have these ideas be a hospitable place to flourish for men and women, and to flourish within a society like ours that isn't really, the person asking for directions, well, if I wanted to go there, I wouldn't be starting from here. You can often feel like that in modern society. If we want to have a healthy relationship between men and women in a society that's hospitable for that, we wouldn't be starting from here. But this is where God has placed us, and so we have to start from here. So that's generally my response to those sorts of questions, the initial phase. Tomorrow we'll be getting into a bit more.
How would you say that a proper understanding of the senses informs us on the idea of the crisis that's been in the church's bride? Or alternatively, how does the role of Christ as strengthened the church's bride inform us about the senses?
That's almost impossible to answer without giving lots of my material for tomorrow. So, we'll be getting into Song of Songs, we'll be getting into Ephesians 5, all these classic texts on that question. But yeah, that's one of the big questions. Yes. That's a very good question. And certainly, when Paul takes up the concept of the restoration of the image of God, he focuses upon the sort of moral life of the person. I'm trying to think where it is. It's in Colossians 2. Let's see. Colossians 3. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, the social and the moral in Colossians chapter 3. I've just lost it again. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. So there the focus tends to be more on the body of the church. Christ is all in all. You are united in him. He is in each one of you. And also the moral sense, renewed in the knowledge of the image. But beyond that, I do think the body has some role. Think about the way that the temple or the tabernacle represent the body politic and also the body of the people. It's one of the reasons why when Christ says the temple of his body, he's not drawing a concept or connection out of thin air. This is what the temple always was. And then as we go through, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. We are the body of Christ. And so I think the body is a site in which the image of God is claimed and reclaimed. And we can even see that in things like our practice of baptism. Our bodies are marked out for restoration. Our bodies are marked out for resurrection. It's not just the image of God in this, the soul or the mind. It's our whole integrated person. Likewise, I think you have celebration of the supper. Christ gives himself as a symbol of his body. And so the renewed image is Christ and his body. His body is the body of the church. Our bodies as members of his body. And so I think you're right to see some implication for the body. Likewise, the fact that we are placed as the image of God within the world. We are situated in the world by our bodies. Our bodies are world and us. They are internal and external. They are self and other. And so I think they're part of, as it were, the means by which we're embedded.
Are head coverings applicable now in worship, or is that a cultural thing? Or head uncoverings
Yep.
for men?
That is, again, very much tomorrow material. We're more or less going through the Bible in order. So any material that comes from, I don't know, Proverbs onwards tomorrow. And if I don't cover it, please make sure I do in the question and answer afterwards.
As you were talking about differences between men and women and the way that men can relate to men in a way that's unique in particular, same for women, I look at the way that maybe expressed itself in churches where men's ministry is man camp, where they go kill things, and women have tea time. And the differences are almost these run to the edges of either hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine. In the church, like, how do you see making space for those gender relationships that might help broaden away from very particular narrow vision?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's particularly an issue for men, in part because men don't have anything of great weight to do together in the way that women have more of a natural sharing in the bearing and raising of children. There is something naturally weighty there that they can gather together around in a way that men don't. men increasingly gather together around certain male-coded forms of consumption. Sports, drinking beer, certain type, they're not bad, they're good things, video games, whatever. I enjoy these things, but it's not going to cause any man to rise to his full stature. And it also tends to be something that flattens out men. So you're acting as, there's a sort of, you're relating as bros rather than actually fathers and son dynamic, intergenerational male community. That is something that we've really lost, in part because the sorts of activities that would be done by men together have largely been squeezed out. And so, if you want to improve those sorts of things, think of some activity that can be led by older men apprenticing younger men. And think of, maybe it's a diaconal type ministry, working to do household jobs for elderly people within the church, or something of weight within the community, something that matters, that's not just leisure, that's not merely consumption, something that actually develops skill and brings out responsibility, that develops strength. Men not just doing whatever comes easiest and most naturally to them, but men actually exerting themselves in ways that will stretch and help them to grow. And I think also something that will help men grow in context of mutual recognition, because it means a lot to be seen and honored by other men, particularly by father figures. And that is something that I think many young men are starved of. So find contexts within the church where you can have things that matter, weighty tasks that you commit to young men, placing responsibility upon their shoulders, that their shoulders have to broaden to bear, and give them older men who will honor them and equip them in that task. And I think that will make a difference. We've reached 4 o'clock. I'm going to be hanging around, so feel free to ask me any further questions.